Critique of Pure Reason, translated by Max Muller, 1881 edition, Section 2 of the Logical Function of the Understanding in Judgments, page 72. If we leave out of consideration the contents of any judgment and fix our attention on the mere form of the understanding, we find that the function of a thought in a judgment can be brought under 4 heads, each of them with 3 subdivisions. They may be represented in the following table. So he says that here we will not consider the content of any judgment, but we will fix our attention on the form of understanding. So here he wants to explore the logical nature of a thought which becomes a judgment. And he explains 4 characteristics of a thought which becomes a judgment. And each of these characteristics has 3 subdivisions. So the first characteristic is the quantity of judgments, and the subdivisions are universal, particular, and singular. So does the judgment or the thought which becomes a judgment quantitatively is universal? Is it universal, or is it particular, or is it singular in nature? The second characteristic is quality. So quality of a judgment means determining if the quality, if the nature of a thought is affirmative, or is it negative, or is it infinite in nature. The third characteristic is relation. So here we explore if the thought which becomes a judgment is categorical, or is it hypothetical, or is it disjunctive. The fourth characteristic is modality. The modality of a thought which becomes a judgment can be expressed in terms of problematical. Is it problematical, is it assertory, or is it apodictic in nature? So he goes on to say, as this classification may seem to differ in some, though not very essential points, from the usual technicalities of logicians, the following reservations against any possible misunderstanding will not be out of place. So he says that this classification, this kind of classification of a thought which becomes a judgment in the form of 4 characteristics is not unusual. It has very few essential points which sets this classification apart from the technicalities of logicians. So logic has its own rules, and he says the classification in logic is not too different from this kind of classification. And he says if there are any misunderstandings, we will clear it now here. So the first misunderstanding that he wants to clear is as follows. So he says logicians are quite right in saying that in using judgments in syllogisms, singular judgments may be treated like universal ones. So he says logicians, he agrees with logicians when they say that in judgment, the use of judgments in syllogisms are basically inferences. So the use of judgments in the use of judgments in syllogisms or in inferences, singular judgments may be treated like universal ones, because the subject is as general as the predicate. For as they have no extent at all, the predicate cannot refer to part only of that which is contained in the concept of the subject and be excluded from the rest. So he says in a syllogism, the predicate cannot only confine itself to the subject and be excluded from the rest of the proposition. The predicate is valid, therefore, of that concept without any exception, as if it were a general concept, having an extent to the whole of which the predicate applies. So he says the predicate applies to the whole of the concept. So the predicate is treated like a general concept. But he says if we compare a singular with a general judgment, looking only at the quantity of the knowledge conveyed by it, the singular judgment stands to the universal judgment as a unity to infinity. So he says singular or particular judgments are different from general judgments or universal judgments. So he says we have to treat them differently. So he says it is therefore, when we consider a singular judgment, judicium singulare, not only according to its own validity, but according to the quantity of knowledge which it conveys, as compared to the other kinds of knowledge, that we see how different it is from the general judgments, judicia communia, and how well it deserves a separate place in a complete table of the varieties of thought in general, though not in a logic limited to the use of judgments in reference to each other. So he says singular judgments have to be treated differently in comparison to general judgments, because when we take into consideration the content of the judgment that it represents, a singular judgment is quite different from general judgments or a universal judgment. So he says in the quantity of judgments, in the classification of the quantity of judgments, he separates the universal judgment from particular and singular. So he says in logic, even if in logic we do not intend to separate logic, such as in syllogisms, we do not intend to separate the predicate. So in syllogisms, the predicate and the subject are treated as general concepts. We have to separate the general concept from the particular or the singular judgment. Thus, he separates the universal judgment from singular judgment and particular judgment.